I was actually reflecting on the fact I think we pushed quite a lot of boundaries with things, with our where we toured work, how we toured work, the approach we took to things, and that was right from day one, actually. So when I joined, the day I joined, we'd just started rehearsals. Literally, it was day one of rehearsals for a small schools tour called Merker's Story, which had been a spin-off from the previous tour, which was On Saturdays This Bed Is Poland. So I'd been appointed, and that had toured after my appointment, but before it actually started. But then they got some additional money to actually do a more explorative piece of work for schools with the character of Merker from that play. So the actress stayed on with us for another 3 or 4 weeks, and we did a schools tour. I remember that being a really interesting, already for the people who already worked there, an interesting change. And then we went straight from that in 2007 into a massively ambitious rural tour of The Hired Man. So it was the first time I think we'd done a big musical. There was 8 in the cast, plus a musical director, plus 2 stage managers on tour for a lot of it. So it was a massive touring company. And that was about sticking true to the values of, I suppose, the artistic values of focusing on stories with rural backgrounds or with a regional background, but it pushed that boundary in terms of the scale of what we could present in, especially in village hall and community settings. But what it did do was also did a big sort of 7 or 8 week theatre tour either side of Christmas. So it toured for 6 months in 2 batches either side of Christmas. Opened at the Courtyard in Hereford, then did a big rural tour, then had a Christmas break, and then came back and did another 6 weeks of theatre touring, which ended with a week at Greenwich. And through that process, we also then came back in June and took it to Brits Off Broadway, which was the first thing that, I'm not sure it was the first thing the company had ever done, but certainly within a year, we'd already taken the show to an international theatre festival. So that excitement was there. And I remember we sort of had a whole range of shows like that on the face of it might be seen as quite gentle, quite safe, but in their own ways were, I suppose, quite groundbreaking, and none more so than Farm Boy in 2009. Now, my memory of this, and I don't know, Daniel, others may remember it slightly differently, but my memory of Farm Boy was we programmed it to fill a gap. We were actually looking to do a new production of another one of Daniel's earlier shows, but couldn't get the rights. And I think I think his kids were at swimming or something, and he was just reading Farm Boy. And a couple of other kids came up and said, we love that book, we love that book. And we had a gap in our schedule, and this was in autumn 2009. So it was originally only supposed to be a 4-week schools tour again, but just to fill that gap. And while we were programming it, we bumped into James Hadrill, who ran Greenwich Theatre. And we were talking about this, and he said, well, the week after that's half-term week, and we've got nothing on our main stage. Do you want to extend it a week and bring it to Greenwich and see how it fits on a stage? And we were like, yeah, that's a great idea. And we've been talking, Daniel and I, about life of work and how, especially in, in any sort of theatre, really, you produce a show, it plays for a certain amount of time and you largely discard it. But how can you really start to look at a life of work and giving it potentially a more commercial or a longer, an income generating life beyond its original production? So when we took it to Greenwich, we invited a company called Scamp Theatre, who'd done quite a lot of work with Michael Morpurgo's shows before. And through that, we developed a plan. We took it to the Edinburgh Festival in 2010, and it was at the Assembly Rooms when it was up on George Street, and we got the sold out ribbons. We did 99% business up in Edinburgh. We were on the review show and Radio 4 and stuff like that with reviews, and through that, we managed to book as co-production with Scamp a 12-week national theatre tour of it in 2009-10. We then got invited back to Brits Off Broadway with it in 2011. We did another national tour of it in 2012. And it was actually just after Daniel had left and Jack had come in as artistic director. The last thing Daniel did was he came back to redirect the final production of final touring production of that. And I think Daniel has just resurrected it again at the Garrick in Lichfield as a story about sort of pushing a boundary of what is a very gentle piece. It's essentially the story of the hare and the tortoise, but but to give it a life that has grown and grown and grown, and what was originally supposed to be 20 school show, I reckon we must have done over 200 performances of that piece over the years. So we were always looking at how we could push those boundaries, I suppose, and that became true of other work we did later on. You know, I was there. I was at the company when we did Dolly. You know, the wonderful other musical, music theatre piece with the story of the cloning of Dolly the sheep, with the background of Dolly Parton music and a Dolly Parton tribute singer. You know, but it worked, and we also went into some more gritty pieces as well. I suppose I remember in 2009, again, I think it was, we produced Wasteland, which was Laura Lomas's piece. She'd been commissioned to create given freedom to create a piece that was of interest to her. And she was interested in the story of Fred Barris, who was the young lad who got shot by Tony Martin when he was breaking into his land in Norfolk. But I think I'm right in saying that that young lad had come from a traveller community in Newark. And so the play Wasteland wasn't that story, but it was the story of a young lad just come out of youth detention who was trying to make a go and how he was sucked back into that. And that was literally down to the fact that at one point we were counting the number of F words, C bombs that were dropped throughout the script, and how we would manage that in a rural touring setting. And to be fair, I think we had one complaint about language in the entire tour, because people trusted the company's brand and they trusted us. And actually a more regular bit of feedback I remember receiving was, you know, I don't like the language, but actually in the context of this piece of work, it's absolutely part of it would sound weird if they weren't using that language, or using, you know, watered down versions like they do on things like EastEnders to cover it off. So there was a whole range of those, you know, we're gently pushing here, gently pushing there. And, you know, it was a real mix of stuff, but it was, I think, pushing boundaries. At the time, our funding was still predominantly to tour to East Midlands village halls and community building. So that was a core element of our funding. So we did have to, when we were looking to go outside of the region or outside of the country, we had to sort of, you know, ensure that white tit space. So that was a core element. And artistically, the company at the time was very interested in those stories of rural life, or of stories that were relevant to East Midlands audiences. Now, as during my 6 years there, those boundaries loosened as time went on, but that was always at the heart of the work that we did. So, you know, Dolly, is in terms of agriculture and rural, it had a very sort of rural theme sitting behind it. Farm Boy was obviously, that Hired Man is set in rural Cumbria. We did a production of another book, an adaptation of another book, The Farm. But all of that work was rooted to some way in one or two of those spaces. But as I say, we were also commissioning pieces of work. You know, just before I started on Saturdays, This is Betty Poland was a much grittier story. In fact, it was actually a bit of a murder mystery, but it was set in Southeast Lincolnshire and researched in the region. You know, The Honeyman that we did in 11, perhaps it was 2011, maybe early 2012, which we'd commissioned from Tyrone. You know, that was part of a wider regional rural touring consortium approach to sort of diversifying the range of voices of writers that were creating work for our type of rural touring company. And whilst it was a particular story of Tyrone's, it was reset into that rural space. So I would categorize them as varied and mixed, but behind them all was that strategy around that rural space and development. And thrown in there as well were a couple of I suppose a couple of left field. So occasionally we would do existing plays. We did a incredible tour of Faith Healer by Brian Friel, you know, which in and itself is about a guy who tours village halls and, you know, community spaces with his, you know, Faith Healer act for some and others. And somebody told me that once on one performance, we actually had a guy who thought it was a real Faith Healer coming to his village. And he'd been given a terminal diagnosis, and he actually turned up because he thought this was a Faith Healer. And, you know, so the power of sort of that work you know, was there throughout. So it wasn't all fluffy, nice stories. There were some really gritty pieces of work that we did along the way as well. There was one that really captured imaginations of audiences wherever we went, which was Those Magnificent Men. Partly because it was incredibly funny. It was a really well written piece of work. The two guys, Richard and Chris, I think it was in our original production, they had such a chemistry in bringing the story of this sort of transatlantic flight to life. But the star of that show, to some extent, was the set, because about halfway through the first act, all of these random sort of bin lids, boxes and stuff, as they're describing and talking to each other and telling the story, they create a biplane out of it. And that got a round of applause pretty much every performance. And that always stuck in my mind, because again, we brought it back, we did a theatre tour with it, we took it to Edinburgh. So again, it had that life. But I think that to me was that's one I always look back on really, really fondly. Yeah, it was a good production. That I think I'm very proud of the work we collectively made. I'm very proud of the development of the company that took place over those 6 years, and that's not least epitomised by seeing how it's continued to adapt and develop under its subsequent artistic directors and Sally's executive leadership. It's brilliant.